Hi Ivan, my name is
Hi.
Céline Rojon. I'm an occupational psychologist and a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm also an active member of the BPS Division of Occupational Psychology, the DOP. I'm really delighted to be here with you today in Manchester, and this is part of our interview series on pioneering members of the DOP. What do we mean by pioneering? By pioneering, we mean members who've been instrumental, not old, instrumental in the setup of the division in 1971, or who've contributed to the success of the division in the early years or all the way through. People such as yourself, really. I've prepared some questions for our interview, but before I start asking the questions, I just wanted to ask you to give us a little bit of background on yourself.
Okay, well, I started my career as a psychologist after graduating from the University of Exeter with a first degree. I didn't really work then as a psychologist as such. I worked in HR for quite a few years, and then went back to university to do a PhD. And then I had my first job as a psychologist, as a senior psychologist in the Department of Employment Group, or DWP as it would be nowadays. I spent a few years there, and then I moved on my first academic job, which was at the University of Aston. And then I basically spent most of my career as an academic occupational psychologist, although always doing some form of consultancy and practitioner work. And then 15 years ago now, helped to found Robertson Cooper, which is a business that specialises in well-being in organisations and employs a good number of occupational psychologists. And that is where I spend most of my time, although I still have links with the university and still like to do research and publish that research as well.
And what would you say got you interested in psychology in the first place?
Well, I have to go back right the way back to school. I was fairly conventional in terms of my subject choice at school, and I did maths, physics and chemistry for A-levels. But even before that, I had thought that I didn't find any of them quite inspiring enough to really want to study at university level and maybe make a career. And quite fortuitously, we had a supply teacher who came into the school and taught a few of our general studies classes. And he'd graduated in psychology, and he was a real advocate for the subject. And I think he got quite a few of us actually interested in thinking this is something that, you know, I could be really interested in. And then we also had a deputy head of the school who had a psychology degree as well. And between the two of them and a few conversations, I thought, because it was quite unusual actually in those days. I'm talking about, I went to university in 1965, so you know it wasn't a popular subject particularly then, and I think it was a bit of an odd choice for somebody who'd done maths, physics, and chemistry. But that was the route, and that was what got me first into psychology and got me onto a psychology degree.
And of course, the math would have really helped you with statistics and psychology as well.
It did, yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think that was one of the reasons why the university actually made me quite a low offer in terms of grades, which was probably just as well. Once I'd had the offer, there was not much incentive to actually improve on the grades. But I think they wanted me, amongst other people, because of I had a science background. And yes, it did help from that point of view, and has done since, really, in the sense that I've always been interested in numbers, actually, you know, more than not being concerned about them. They've fascinated me.
You said earlier that you worked in HR for a little while. Is that where you got interested in occupational psychology, or how did that come about?
A little bit, maybe, but I didn't think of myself as a psychologist then, and I also didn't really know what kind of career I was going to have until quite late on, and by that stage. So I don't think it was really. I think it was more as I was doing my PhD and I was thinking about what I would like to do, and I became aware of the fact, just through contacts and friends I had, that there were quite a few, and there were a lot at the time actually, psychologists working in the civil service. And I talked to them about what they were doing, and that got me thinking, yeah, that sounds interesting, I could do that, I could be interested in that. And so it was that really that got me interested.
If we're thinking now about occupational psychology and perhaps some of the theories or studies or findings, what do you think, what has really impressed you, or what do you think has been really important for our field? What has influenced your work?
I'd pick out a few things, I think. Probably the one that's had the most widespread impact doesn't really originate in British occupational psychology. It comes from the Americans, and it started life with Jack Hunter and Frank Schmidt as what was referred to then as validity generalization. In other words, looking to see whether you could demonstrate the population validity of a selection tool by aggregating all the statistics, doing some analysis on that, and then demonstrating what the population validity level was. And that over time has morphed into meta-analysis. And meta-analysis, of course, is now something that's used across all the sciences, all the social sciences. And as far as I know, one of the primary areas where that originated is in American industrial organizational psychology, but I still classify that as one of the things that's really made a difference, not just in occupational psychology, but much more widely than that. So, you know, that's one. And I've done a few meta-analyses myself, in fact. And I'll make this claim on film now. I may have produced the first, and this was 1989, the first meta-analysis paper by a British psychologist, maybe by any UK author. I'm not sure about that. But,
what was the topic of that?
That was a meta-analysis of trainability testing. Trainability testing, which was originated by Sylvia Downs at the Industrial Training Research Unit in Cambridge. And I'd been involved for several years developing trainability tests, in part when I worked in the Department of Employment Group, and worked with Sylvia for a while, and we had done a narrative review about 10 years before that. But then we decided to have a look at whether we could do a quantitative meta-analysis of trainability testing. So she dug out all the data, and then together we worked on the analysis. So meta-analysis would be one, to go back to your question. I think the other one that particularly is important to me nowadays and influences a lot of the work that we do here at Robertson Cooper is the work on the factors that sometimes called job stressors. So the factors that influence people's everyday experience of their work from a psychological perspective. And I'm talking primarily about the influence of control, the influence of other factors on people's workplace, and particularly the models that have been developed to look at those factors. So that would be a second thing that I think has been important in the world of work and important for psychologists, and certainly had an impact on the work I've done more recently over the last 10 years or so. Most of my career when I worked as an academic was spent looking at psychological measurement issues. So there I think it's the whole... One of the things that psychologists in general, and particularly occupational psychologists, bring to situations very often, I think, is valid and reliable measurement. And so the whole idea of psychometric measurement, how you can go about doing that, what you can measure, how you can improve that, and how you can make use of it, is an area that, for me, has been a long-term area of interest, both in terms of ability areas, but particularly in terms of personality as well.
Is there anyone within occupational psychology that you would consider a personal hero of yours?
Well, I hesitate to label my long-time friend and colleague Cary Cooper in that respect, because he's a good mate, so it's difficult to think of him as a hero. But I certainly think that the move I made to Manchester when Cary was there was probably the biggest single influence on my career. The first book I ever did, I did with Cary. And so, you know, yeah, he's had a massive influence on my career, and we still work together nowadays. In terms of heroes, I think heroes, for me, they need to be a bit more distant and not really close. And then I have to go to the Americans again. The first occupational psychology textbook I ever owned was Blum and Naylor, which probably most people have not heard of today. And I never met either of those two. The one after that was a book that I think probably influenced a lot of my generation of occupational psychologists, was Landy and Trumbo, Psychology of Work Behaviour. I met Frank Landy and knew him very well. So he'd be one of my heroes. And then the other, to go back to the conversation about meta-analysis, would be Jack Hunter, because I think, you know, he made a really significant contribution, not just to our own field, but much wider than that as well.
So we just talked about your own heroes in occupational psychology, but you, of course, yourself had an illustrious career, both in academia and also in practice. What are you particularly proud of? What are the achievements that you're particularly proud of?
The first thing that comes to mind there would be the PhD and MSc students that I've supervised, and maybe some undergraduates as well. So I think the impact that, however small or bigger that might have been, that I've had on other people's development, their understanding of the discipline, and the development of their own careers. I've got a bookshelf in my conservatory at home, which is stacked full, literally, of the dissertations and theses of people that I've supervised. So, you know, I think that's number one. Probably the second one would be creating the business that I spend my time in now, Robertson Cooper. We've employed, over the 10-15 years where we've been building up our staff, we've employed good numbers of occupational psychologists, not all of them from Manchester. We've taken people from all over the country, and we still are recruiting people. And trying to work in an area that's not that common for psychologists to work in. Most psychologists who work in practice focus on the selection and assessment area. And we're trying to develop our expertise and trying to develop our influence in a different area.
Mm-hmm. So what is the area that you focus on now?
Well, specifically psychological health and well-being in organisations. And over the last 10, 12 years, I've shifted my focus away from selection and assessment, and the publications that I've made, books I've done, and other pieces of research have all been concentrated on that area. And that's what we try and do as a business. That's how we try to help organisations to improve the health and well-being of their employees, particularly their psychological health. And that's not really just about preventing stress. The idea behind what we try to do is that if you can just elevate the psychological health and well-being of everybody in an organisation, that's good for them. And it turns out from most of the research that's being done more recently, it's good for the organisation as well in terms of organisation level outcomes.
Occupational psychology, I guess, is relatively young still as a division in the UK and indeed worldwide. But I get the feeling that the public now understands occupational psychology a bit more than maybe they used to, although we still have a long way to go. What do you think are the challenges to promoting the discipline?
I think we have this model within occupational psychology of the science and the practice. And to an extent, I think the area where we need to do more and more work is integrating those two things. I don't think you can practice effectively as an occupational psychologist by ignoring or not drawing on the science. Equally, I think the people who are developing the science of the discipline can't do that effectively if they focus only on the topics that are of interest in the literature and of interest in the journals, where they gain lots of kudos to help their academic career along. And I think what we're finding at the moment is that there is too much of a separation between those two areas, and closing that gap would make the profession much more effective. And the professions where that gap is closed are the ones who are much more effective. I feel like occupational psychology, it's in an interesting stage really, because we possibly are having more influence on a wider basis across more areas. But the numbers of people coming into the profession, at least according to the popularity of master's programs, appears to be at best stable, if not shrinking somewhat. And I think that's because partly it's very difficult for people to find employment.
What is your vision for the future of occupational psychology? What role should occupational psychology play in our society?
I think it would be really helpful if psychologists were more involved in policy level decision making. If you look at what goes on in government circles, there have been some things where occupational psychologists have been involved. Foresight reports, reports on health and well-being in the workplace, for instance. But in general, policy at government level is led and influenced in terms of the technical input by economists. And behavioural economists are now moving into the space that maybe psychologists could be occupying at least part of. Now, I'm not against that. I'm not saying, that's our turf, they should stay off it. But I think we're missing opportunities in moving into that area as well. And what I would really like to see is psychologists being involved at the top level in government policy making, and also being involved at a more strategic level in organisational decision making as well. And I think if you look at practitioner psychologists, we've built a really good reputation for ourselves in terms of selection and assessment work. But where that tends to operate is more at the technician level, delivering assessment centres for organisations, delivering executive level assessments and so on. And all that's very useful, but it doesn't give us a seat in the C-suite. It doesn't give us a seat at the top table to really have an impact and an influence. And I think both government policy and organisations would be better for that. But how you bring about that difference is difficult.
Do you have any ideas, any suggestions how we could do that?
Well, I mean, it is hard, and so I'm not kind of saying that I can sit here and say this is how we should do it, because I've tried to be involved in those kind of things with limited success. How do we do it? I think one of the things, and it goes back to my thoughts about the science practitioner distinction, is that, and I said earlier on, you can't be a good practitioner psychologist if you ignore the science and you don't draw on the science. On the other hand, you have to provide people with advice. And very, very often, the science runs out of certainties. And so you have to provide advice that's the best thing that you can offer. Mm-hmm. And you have to be confident about that. and maybe bolder about giving that advice, even though you're not standing entirely on a solid platform of science. And I think, again, at the practitioner end, either there's a tendency to say, the science doesn't help me, so I'm ignoring it, or the science doesn't go far enough, so I can't make a choice, I can't make a decision, I can't give you any advice. And I think, you know, if we were bolder and more confident and more assertive about the advice that we offer and what we think should and shouldn't be done, it would help in that respect. You know, and you've got things like the behavioural insights unit at government level, the so-called nudge units. Now they've taken that and they've worked in that direction, and they've focused on things where psychology has something to say, and then they've been very clear and definite about this is what you should do in government. And some of that's been really effective, and some of it's been ridiculed. But then that's again what you get if you stick your head above the parapet and try to have an impact.
If you could change one thing about occupational psychology or about the division of occupational psychology, what would it be? For me, that's really simple and straightforward. I think the process of coming into the profession and becoming chartered, becoming eligible to register for HCPC is too complicated, too difficult, too long-winded, and it puts a lot of people off. And I know for sure that there are people who are perfectly good practitioner psychologists, and for one reason or another, they've never got through as far as becoming chartered. And I blame the process and not them. And I really think that is something that needs attention. I fully understand that you have to have requirements for people. You have to have things that people need to satisfy in order to be able to participate fully in the profession and to be seen as practitioners. But other professions manage to do it without making the hurdles quite so difficult and confusing, I have to say. A lot of people I speak to who are trying to go through the process really find it a struggle just to understand what they have to do and then to do it. It's really, really hard for them. And it's too hard in the wrong way. So what would you like the incoming generation of occupational psychologists to be aware of?
I think it would be healthy for psychology and for researchers and practitioners, and I think researchers are better at doing this, to move away from the selection and assessment space where our work in terms of practice tends to be focused. I want to add to that, though, that I think that's a very good area for psychologists to work in, and I think we're having a very good impact, a very positive impact. So I'm not negative about that. It's just that I feel that there's too much concentration in that area, particularly for practitioners. And I also think that for people who work on the academic side, an attempt to focus more of their efforts on problems that really arise in organisations rather than problems that arise in the literature. And unfortunately, those two things do seem to be different some of the time. And I think that would help, again, with coalescing the profession and drawing the science and practice together. Finally, I think, and we talked about my background in science and maths before I moved into psychology, I would like to ensure that we retain the statistical, quantitative elements in our training. And I think there's a bit of a tendency sometimes for people who are not too comfortable with that to avoid it or drift away from it. And I think it's not important that you actually work in that area. And again, I'm not negative about qualitative approaches, not at all. But I think you have to do that. You have to have a sound grounding in both qualitative and quantitative methods and models to be an effective psychologist. And then you can specialise in one or the other, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. They were all the questions that I had for you. Is there anything that you want to add?
I don't think so. No, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for speaking to me today. Thank you.